Hello, welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. This is my philosophy of religion channel, not my geopolitics channel, sister one to this one. So if you're wondering why I'm talking about this, that's the reason. What is the this? Well, I'm going to talk to you about, or I'm going to do a bit of a live reaction to Joe Rogan talk to JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States. Now, I haven't listened to the whole of this, so this will be a bit of a live reaction. I'm going to stop it and cast my opinion. So it'll be stop, start, stop, start. If you want to go and watch the whole thing, go and watch Joe Rogan's podcast and not listen to me talk about this. So I'm going to talk about Joe Rogan and uh, really JD Vance expressing his views on religion in the armed forces. We're also going to look at the Ten Commandments in schools. So let's get to it. Let's see what they have to say about these subjects. Okay. So here we have the Joe Rogan show, and the vice president is his guest.
There's people that, again, they live their life in a very a beautiful way, and they follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, and they're very admirable. And I think that's very attractive, and it makes people very curious about that religion. I think that brings people to Christ, and I think it brings people to religion.
Sure.
But then there's people like, did you read that report that came from at the start of the Iran war, where there was a guy who was an officer, non-commissioned officer, who was at a briefing, and this guy came in as explaining to them that they didn't need to be afraid because this war was important because Trump had been anointed by Jesus Christ to bring about his return. And the way Jesus is going to return is by bombing Iran.
Now, I reported this at the time on my other channel, my geopolitics channel, because I found this pretty disturbing that the whole Iran conflict was being framed as some kind of crusade. It reminds me of like the Bush and the Second Iraq War, Second Gulf War. This had hallmarks of that, but it was an overt religiosity that wasn't just sort of leaking through; it was driving certainly this commander to say what he was saying and to, I guess, to do what he was doing as far as he saw it. He saw it in terms of a religious crusade, really. Now, you had complaints from soldiers at the time that this was taking place, that this had been said. And now we're going to hear JD Vance approached with this issue, who is himself, JD Vance, he's had this conversion to Catholicism, just written a book on it. He is a massive advocate for religion. How is he going to deal with this lack of separation of church and state? With a state, the armed forces are, commanders are forcing a religious lens onto the soldiers, their subordinates, but not just the lens through which you see things. It's like, this is the rationale why you're putting your body on the line type thing. It's for Jesus. Hang on. No, that's not why I'm doing it, many soldiers would say. And there's a bit of a problem with this approach.
I did not see that report.
Okay,
that sounds pretty far out there to me.
This is the kind of right-wing thinking. So here it is. Military commander tells troops bombing Iran is part of God's divine plan. So we started getting calls in the wee hours of Saturday morning from people saying their commanders were just jubilant about this, trying to tell people, don't worry, it's all part of God's plan. They promised a 200-mile-long river that is 4.5 feet deep, filled with nothing but the blood that their weaponized version of Jesus will spill at the Battle of Armageddon, Weinstein said. But what was the one? There was an article where the guy was explaining the actual quotes that the one officer was telling him, the one commander. Yeah, but it's not that. It was very specific. It was very specific what he said.
I mean, for what it's worth, my attitude on this stuff is, I mean, first of all, as a Christian, you sort of believe that everything is part of God's plan, even things that are ultimately very terrible. I mean, you kind of have to
Hold
make
up, but let me
yeah.
read the quote. He urged us to tell our troops that this was all part of God's divine plan, and he specifically referenced numerous citations out of the book of Revelations referring to Armageddon and the imminent return of Jesus Christ. He said that President Trump had been anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon and mark his return to earth.
Okay.
If I'm in that meeting, I'm like, hit the brakes. Hit the brakes. What?
That's where you need some of the psychedelics we talked about at the last Joe Rogan JD Vance conversation.
That would definitely help.
I mean, okay, my response that, first of all, like, obviously, do I endorse that? No. Do
I endorse that? No. But yes.
I think that it's important that people rein it in a little bit, because I'm sure you're right. There were a lot of troops there, probably a lot of Christian troops there who are like, I'm not sure this is exactly right.
Right.
But the important point is, I think it's important as a Christian leader, as Christians, period. One of the things we have to do is just have humility in the face of God's plan. There's a lot that we don't understand. There's a lot that we don't get. And I think especially on matters of war and peace, the approach that I try to take is you try to make the best decisions that you can. You hope that you're on God's side. You don't assume that God has taken your side. That's a very famous Abraham Lincoln quote. And that's the attitude that I take. So for that,
so there's a bit of theology to be done here. And I find it actually quite problematic what he's saying here, because on the one hand, the whole God's plan thing is, and I'm just spitballing, this is stream of consciousness talking, as it always is with me. On the one hand, the kind of God's plan idea is this Mysterianism, that I can't understand the mind of God, but I just know that it works. I have faith that God has a plan. But then he goes on, JD Vance, to say, well, you don't know if you're on God's side here. So God's got a plan, but I don't know if I'm kind of enacting God's will and I'm aligned with God's plan. So then how do I navigate that? And of course, I've talked about this before. I've written about this in one of my books explicitly, about how there is an epistemic barrier between you and God. So even if you believe God is the arbiter of morality and the foundation of all morality on earth and in the universe, since there's an epistemic barrier between you and God, like, I don't know if I'm accessing God, the right God, or the right understanding of God, or the right interpretation of God's holy book, all this stuff going on. Like, you've got that epistemic barrier, the barrier of knowledge between you and God. So all you can do is rely on your own morality. So it doesn't matter if God is the arbiter of morality and underwrites all of morality, if you still have to subjectively interpret that and then work your own, path out, morally speaking, in life. And to do your own moral evaluations, and try and make the best stab at living. Well, that looks rather like secular morality then, like, because you don't know if your sense of morality aligns with God. You don't know if your interpretation of the Bible was the intended interpretation that God has. And just kind of JD Vance gets that right to a degree. But then on the other hand, he's saying, well, it's all part of God's plan, which is kind of fatalistic. You can it's a bit like free will fatalists, where I don't believe that libertarian free will exists, but you've got to be wary of a fatalism, which is why there's no point getting up in the morning because there's nothing I can do because it's all kind of deterministic or whatever. Well, if God's got a plan, there's nothing I can do about it, you can just look at the things going on in the world, like horrific things going on in the world, and say, well, it's part of God's plan. And then, well, why should I change what God wants here? But then if I am being used as a tool to try and make this better, then I'm just an instrument of God. And like, that means that God is using utilitarian ethics, where you can use people as a means to an end rather than as an end. And so it's just an incoherent mess, right? That is the problem with the whole kind of God's plan approach, which is like, well, how do I know whether God wants that horrible thing to happen? Like, I can't stop a tsunami, right? I can't stop a tsunami. Humanity can't really stop a tsunami from a an earthquake in the middle of the ocean, and that's horrific, and that's God's plan. Like, then what do we? Okay, well, I can't stop a war on my own, but then does God want that war to happen? Like, he just had a tsunami that's killed 240,000 people. Like, he obviously wanted that to happen, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. Like, God can control the natural order in a way that humans can't, right? So if he wanted that not to happen, he would have stopped it. Well, if he wanted this, if he didn't want it to happen, sorry, he would have stopped it. If God didn't want this war to happen, he could easily stop it. So he wants this war to happen for some reason. Is it so that the expression of human free will can play out? Is it so that we learn? You're trying to second guess what God's ultimate plan is. God has a plan, yeah, but does it go this way or that way? And in the end, you just like, well, sod it. I've just got to do what I have to do. And so, like, the whole kind of God's plan thing, I think, just is so incoherent, it becomes irrelevant, and you should just forget it and just try and make the best of things from a human moral point of view. And if you do believe in God, I guess you just got to hope that God recognizes that and says, yeah, good job. Actually, you were being a decent human being. You weren't just kind of throwing your hands up and say it's all part of God's plan and not doing anything about the horrific things that are taking place in the world on a consistent basis, and just defer wholly to the God's plan thesis. So I'm just, as I say, spitballing here, but I have a real problem with this approach. I'm going to rewind that a little bit and just go through that again from his point of view.
Hey, I'm like, hit the brakes.
Joe Rogan, JD Vance.
There's people that, again, they live their life. That would definitely help.
I mean, this is exactly right.
Right.
But the important point is, I think it's important as a Christian leader, as Christians, period. One of the things we have to do is just have humility in the face of God's plan. There's a lot that we don't understand. There's a lot that we don't get. And I think especially on matters of war and peace, the approach that I try to take is you try to make the best decisions that you can. You hope that you're on God's side. You don't assume that God has taken your side. That's a very famous Abraham Lincoln quote. And that's the attitude that I take. So for that, what I would encourage that NCO to say is, you know what? God is in control. We don't know what's going to happen, but let's pray and try to do as good of a job as we can, trusting in God. If I was speaking to a group of Christian troops, that's what I would say.
But you're not speaking to a group of Christian troops. You're speaking to a group of troops. That's the point, right? You've got a pluralistic society, and you've got an armed forces that is reflected, you would hope, reflective of that pluralistic society. And you need to speak to them in a way that appeals to all of them. You're not selecting off the Christians. So you put your hand up if you're Christian, right? I'm going to speak to you guys over here. You use some kind of motivational speech. The rest of you guys, whatever. That's not how you do it. So, even in saying that, there are problems.
But you're speaking to a group of troops.
Sure.
You don't know if they're Christian. You
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know. I mean, you're essentially letting these people know that you believe that Trump was anointed by Jesus to bomb Iran so that Jesus can come back to Earth.
Come back in a fire
If I was
of
there,
Armageddon.
I'd be like, can I get the fuck out of here?
Yeah, I hear you, man. I hear you. Look.
And he's trying to be all like, I hear you, man. Yeah, I'm going, we need to take, some of those psychedelics, or, JD Vance is trying to play Rogan and the audience here. But he would be singing a very different song if he was on some kind of Christian podcast, no doubt. But yeah, Joe Rogan's right there. And when you start confusing then ideas of Trump and the presidency, and framing that in terms of overt religiosity, that Trump is anointed by God, the whole thing then becomes, this Iran war becomes overtly political and religious in a way that is, I think, excluding all of those troops that aren't agreeing that Trump is the anointed one, or even the president that they want. You're fighting really for the Constitution, for ideas that are bigger than president, but he's become this kind of dictatorial president whereby it's all about him. The United States is him. The United States' success is his and his family's success, and the amount they grift on the back of these foreign policy decisions. And then you're bringing religion in as well, and it's just it's certainly not pluralistic.
Yes, and that is the first that I have ever heard of this particular story.
How?
I don't see how that can be the case. This is a big old story back when it happened, right? And there's no doubt that he would have been briefed on that. And Joe Rogan sounds like he's just about to go,
That is the first that I have ever heard of this particular story.
How have you not heard of this and Biden's 2 brain surgeries?
Apparently, I live in a bunker, man.
How do you not know about these things? That's crazy.
Wild. Okay, here's the other thing I'll say is having heard about this for the first time just now.
Yeah, whatever.
To your point about the media, I do think it's possible, let's be honest, that whatever that dude said, maybe it was good, maybe it was bad, has been misreported by the press.
Oh, so all right. I'm basically just not believing that article. I'm not believing the accounts of those people that came out and complained about it initially. It's just skewed by the press. That's how I'm going to get out of having to deal with this uncomfortable position.
So I always have a filter on this stuff. Like I don't automatically assume.
It's also possible that this is the other thing. He said the commander supposedly had a big grin on his face when he said all this, which made his message seem even more crazy.
And I think that's, again, I don't think anybody should have war is sometimes necessary, but it's never a good thing. And I think that's like a fundamental Christian principle is there are just wars, there are necessary wars, but war is always something that you try to avoid.
Yeah, the whole just war thesis, which is kind of like, I guess, still kind of moral consequentialism. Interestingly, maybe. Okay, there's another snippet here where they discuss religious topics, and this is education and the Ten Commandments.
You know, one of the things I had James Tallarico on the podcast, and
if you don't know, James Tallarico is now the Democratic senatorial candidate for Texas, running against what would have been John Cornyn, but now Ken Paxton, who is an absolute MAGA, actually fairly unpopular across the board, Ken Paxton, but has that vehement MAGA support, which has got him over the line in terms of becoming the Republican candidate. So James Tallarico is a progressive, but he's a Christian, and he wears his Christianity on his sleeve, but he also believes in the separation of church and state. He's been on Joe Rogan and has advocated for a liberal progressive Christianity that shouldn't be used as a political cudgel to beat people with, kind of like you just saw in the last snippet, right? Which is, that shouldn't be in the armed forces. And he would say, Tallarico, as a Christian, I believe that has no role in the armed forces of the United States. And Joe Rogan is putting James Tallarico's previous interview with him up here as, as a sort of person that would disagree with what they're just about to talk about.
Things that I think he has a really good point about, even though I know you're Catholic and you're very religious, putting the 10 Commandments in schools, I don't think is the right way to do it. And this is a guy, Tallarico, who was in seminary and is very Christian.
Mm-hmm.
He just thinks that even though he believes in the 10 Commandments, if you're just only representing the Christian faith in these schools, you're forcing your religion into other people's lives, and that this is going to push people away from Christianity rather than encourage them to pursue it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you never want to force things on people. And I think one of the core Christian contributions to Western civilization is the idea of freedom of religion. It's actually very much a Christian idea.
Is it?
Because you recognize the dignity of each individual.
So you're saying if you're not Christian, you cannot recognize the dignity of each individual? That is demonstrably false. So that is wrong for just as a point.
And part of recognizing that dignity is that each person has to find their own pathway to God. You can't force this on anybody.
Part of recognizing other people's human dignity is understanding they have to find their own pathway to God. So dignity is necessarily connected to the existence of God. Whoa. That's just wrong on so many levels. You can't have dignity unless you're on a pathway to God, to finding God. So that whole statement was utter BS as far as I am concerned. Let's just make sure I've got that right, though. Let's rewind that.
Things on people. And I think one of the core Christian contributions to Western civilization is the idea of freedom of religion. It's actually very much a Christian idea because you recognize the dignity of each individual. And part of recognizing that dignity is that each person has to find their own pathway to God. You can't
No. Okay, that's just wrong. Yeah, I was right. That is wrong.
force this on anybody. I don't think putting the 10 Commandments up in school is like forcing things on anybody.
But it's public schools. So, I mean, if you're going to do that, why not put Buddhist scripture? Why not put, Muslim stuff? You could make an argument why you should have a bunch of different religious tenets in schools.
I think
absolutely, and I'm pretty annoyed that that clip has finished just there. Okay, here's the full YouTube video of it. Let's take it back a couple of seconds.
Muslim stuff. You could make an argument why you should have a bunch of different religious tenets in schools.
I think in the Supreme Court there actually are a lot of different sort of historical, cultural, legal documents that are up there, and I want to say that Moses coming down with a tablet is one of them, but I think there actually are.
This is what's he saying? He said in the Supreme Court there are a bunch of religious cultural documents that are up there. Like, what?
Or other cultural, maybe even other religious elements of this, like where you recognize that a big part of sort of the law-giving tradition in Western civilization is some of these religious texts, not exclusively Christian religious texts. Obviously, some Jewish. There's like an important contribution from the Muslim world in this. So I guess I don't think of it as exclusionary, while also recognizing that America is a society. Our founders were people who were very much influenced, even if they weren't Christians. A lot of them, of course, were, but were very influenced by Christian culture and articulating American law. So my argument would be, even if you're not a Christian, like, does seeing the 10 Commandments, let me put it a slightly different way. Does seeing the 10 Commandments force religion on a non-Christian child? I mean, my argument would
yes, in a very subliminal way, you could argue, but it's certainly reinforcing a truth claim to Christianity, I would say, or attempting to. His position here is completely untenable. You've got taxpayers paying for the government to put religious, both iconography, theology, and claims up in a school, and then supposedly at the same time saying, well, it's not. I mean, his idea that it's just what influenced the culture of the times of the founding fathers, and therefore it has historical interest or something like that. No, the schools are putting it up there to say, this is true, and your tax dollars have paid for us to say that this is true. Like, so he's completely changing the agenda of these schools in doing that, and he's also interpreting the separation of church and state pretty dodgily here. And I don't think he's got a leg to stand on with this sort of approach.
Be no, and I'd illustrate this by saying, well, there are all of these ways in which you actually could try to force religion on a child, right?
Well, it's not the worst way to force religion on a child, but to have it and not represent any other religion. This is Texas.
This is a very good point from Joe Rogan. He's absolutely bang on there. Yeah, there are worse ways. You stop going to the worst and say, well, at least it's not that. Yeah, but it is this, and that's not cool.
By the way.
Sure.
So what he's talking about was that there's these Christian nationalists, these guys that are very wealthy, that are trying to fund Christian schools and trying to defund public schools or any other kind of religious school. And what they want to do, and they passed this to get the 10 Commandments in all public school classes. And he's fundamentally opposed to that as a Christian, because he thinks it's going to force people to have this in their class, and it's going to push people away from Christianity.
I mean, I understand the argument. I just don't see it that way. I mean, I guess if
I don't see it that way. Or at least I don't actually see it that way about pushing people away from Christianity. It is just an infraction in terms of the separation of church and state. And if you have in Texas classrooms, every single classroom has the 10 Commandments, you are essentially Christianizing the public school system there, whereby tax dollars are being spent to I wouldn't say prop up the Christian religion, but to prioritize and privilege the Christian religion over every other religion, and nuns, non-religious. And I find that incredibly problematic. And JD Vance is trying to be as slippery as possible here in essentially saying it's fine.
If
I kind of
I'm
agree
a
with
if
them.
I hear you, but if I'm a non-religious student and I'm sitting in there and I see the 10 commandments, at the very least, I think I can appreciate it. I mean,
Okay, but
I
what if
talk
you're
about this in my book. I went through sort of a
What if you're a Hindu? What if you're a Muslim, and and you are seeing that represented, but not your faith?
well,
It's a public school.
first of all, I think that you I mean, I'm pretty sure Muslims, I'm not hardly an expert on Islam, but I think all of the Abrahamic faiths recognize.
I was going to say this. So actually, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is relevant for Muslims and obviously Jews and Christians. So the Ten Commandments would still be relevant for them. But would he be defending some kind of humanist proposition on the wall, like saying you can be good without God and having the tenets of humanism on there? Those are the tenets of Christianity, supposedly. That's a decalogue provided by God to Moses on these tablets, right? So that is how the Judeo-Christian God or Abrahamic faith God sees morality. Well, then surely you would advocate then for humanists allowing moral propositions being put up on the wall that explicitly state that God is not required, right? You'll be fine with that. I'm sure you'll be fine with that, JD.
As the 10 Commandments as like a significant thing. But I think if I was a Hindu looking at the 10 Commandments, I mean, again, it's hard for me to say this, right, from my perspective, but I certainly went through an atheist phase in my youth. And what I would see that as a non-religious person or a different religion is I would say this is like an important cultural element of the Western civilization, which is the foundation of the classroom that I'm sitting in. And this idea that
absolute bollocks, because the foundation of the classroom you're sitting in, I mean, we can go back to the Greek times, the academy. We can, what are the foundations of the classroom you're sitting in? What are you really talking about there? How would you set out the foundations of teaching and learning, of pedagogy, of coming together to learn to create a better society, or to give you the skills to be an active member of society and have the skills to work? What has that got to do with the 10 Commandments? Like, how do they play a part in the cultural foundation of classroom learning? Just absolutely fundamentally disagree with JD Vance here.
The law comes and is sort of above any man, even if you don't believe in God yourself. I think that's like an important concept. I mean, if you look at the 10 Commandments,
that's an important concept. If you put it in, say, an RE, religious education classroom, by all means, put up posters in an RE classroom where you have all the different religions having their all information or theological points made by those religions, or atheism, humanism, whatever. Have your stuff up and around, but that you're going into this sort of context where you're learning about all of these things very explicitly. You don't just have it up in a classroom where you're sitting there every day and you've got Christian only, or you could say Abrahamic faith only religious doctrine subliminally working on you.
Probably 8 of them or something that I would hope that everybody would agree with, even if they're not themselves religious. So I guess here's my view on it. Like, I would not be offended if I sat in a classroom as a Christian, or if my kids sat in a classroom as a Christian and saw, a religious text that wasn't Christian on the wall. I would encourage them to see that. No, I'd encourage them to see that as a learning experience. To try to understand
what if it was
things
from the Quran? What a bunch of
so I think this needs real unpicking, because I think actually he wouldn't agree with that if it was in your general classroom. That is fine if it's a learning experience. If you put this stuff up as a learning experience, that's an RE classroom. That's a religious education classroom. It's not your general maths classroom or whatever, or your just general primary school or elementary school classroom where you just have that sitting there, or some other random religious he definitely would not advocate for parts of the Quran to be up randomly in classrooms. I'm sure that he's just saying that. I know that's speculative on my part. I'm sure he's just saying that because he knows he's on a sticky wicket here. It's difficult to advocate for the Ten Commandments to be up without having to say something like this as well.
I guess it depends on what it was, right? If it's like something crazy, but no, I mean, if it's something that is like culturally interesting, I guess I don't have a problem with my kid reading something.
The problem is it's mandated. Like if you have a classroom and the teacher is Christian and the teacher wants to have it in their classroom, maybe that's one thing. But if you're mandating that you're going to have the 10 Commandments in classrooms, that's a different thing, because now you're pushing Christianity on kids. And this is Tallarico's position. And as a Christian, he's saying, I think this is going to push children away from Christianity.
So I understand what he's saying. I think that part of living in a society where you have different people with different perspectives, but you do have, I mean, Christianity is the majority religion of the United States. It is the religion that was extraordinarily influential to our founding, to the constitutional principles. Again, freedom of religion is itself not really a liberal concept. It was originally derived from a Christian idea about free will and the dignity of the person. I think part of that is that you accept that you're going to have exposure to different things, and if
this is just a slippery slope. Oh, we just allow this one, and then next time, oh, just allow that, and then before you know it, you've got religious theocracy. You've got theocracy, and you're living in a Gilead or whatever. No, absolutely not. You have separation of church and state, or you don't.
A state legislator in a majority Christian state wants to, it's not like they're putting the 10 Commandments in front of these kids and saying, you have to read this and, write it 500 times a day. They're exposing kids to something. And I'm comfortable with kids being exposed to a lot of different things. I think that's part of living in a society where there's a free exchange of ideas. And
but they're not mandating other things, though. They're only mandating the 10 Commandments. They're not mandating having other things up. So your argument is completely moot. I don't mind them having a whole variety of things. They don't have a whole variety of things up. This is being mandated by, in this case, the Texas School Board, I guess, or the Texas government. And they're not mandating you have a whole bunch of interesting religious stuff. They're mandating you have the 10 Commandments from the Bible up on the wall. And that, what then next happen? What happens next? What's the next chipping away of that separation of church and state that Texas will enact?
The worry about what Tallarico's sort of perspective here is again, I'm not saying that I don't want kids to be exposed to anything that is outside of the Christian canon. Like I actually want my kids exposed to things. I write about this in the book, that I think it's important to have a grounded enough faith that you can engage with a lot of different ideas and still ultimately, sort of hold on to your Christian faith. But isn't part of just living in a like pluralistic democracy that people are going to be exposed to different things? And, I would kind of put it
in the right context, in the RE classroom. When you're doing religious education, religious studies, whatever you call it, that's when absolutely, you're right. You are right there, but in a different context. That is not in every classroom in the country or in the state, that you have this one thing and one thing only mandated.
On Tallarico in a slightly different way, that for a long time in this country, there were actually Supreme Court rulings that said that you cannot pray in a school, even a student organization led by the students, or that you cannot put the 10 Commandments up, even a teacher who chose to do it in their own classroom. And so I think you're always kind of trying to strike this balance, given that we have the First Amendment in this country, between allowing the practice of religious faith in public spaces and possibly forcing religion on other people. I think you have to strike that balance the right way. I guess I just say is that if the 10 Commandments being in a classroom is the thing that you think is forcing religion on somebody, was he equally offended when the 10 Commandments were like quite literally prohibited from being listed in a public building?
I don't know if
it's just this is the tip of the wedge. This is the whole wedge approach. This is what creationists did with young Earth creationism and anti-evolution stuff is they just wedge in this little thing, and then that opens the door to more and more and more. It's a wedge issue, and you've got to stop the wedge issues. So I'm afraid JD Vance is just advocating for a wedge to be um, slammed into the Texas classroom, and now he might not have a vision of anything else happening after that. But my goodness, there will be Christian nationalists in Texas who do have a very clear vision of what other things they want to get into the Texas classroom.
He was offended by that, or if he was opposed to that. But the idea of being exposed to it is one thing, it being mandatory is another. And to mandate that in classrooms
100%.
is a different thing, because you're clearly promoting Christianity. And his position is that promoting Christianity in that way is going to have an opposite effect on children. You're pushing it on them. Instead, you're not just exposing it to them, you're pushing it on them. And especially,
I'm sure Tallarico isn't just arguing in that way as well. I'm sure there is an element of the separation of church and state still being a valuable idea that needs to continue.
especially if you're pushing it on children who come from a household that has a different faith.
I guess I just think the balance in our country the last 30, 40 years has actually been much more in the other direction, which is that we try to completely remove religion from the public square. And I think that's
absolute rubbish when you look at what's been happening over time. And it just, last 30, 40 years, the whole creation debates and textbooks, Texas school board having, absolute rubbish. I'm sorry, JD Vance, you're talking nonsense.
That poses its own problems because, people practice their faith in all kinds of ways.
But do you think that that's the responsibility of churches and synagogues and wherever that, like, if you want, and in the community, if you want to promote religion, promote it that way. But promoting in public schools should be just educational. And if you're in a religious class and a class is teaching about religion, that's a different story.
Well,
yeah, there we are.
You're right. It's certainly the responsibility of churches and synagogues and mosques and so forth. But I also think that, the late Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist sort of said this, that if your approach to religion in public life always and everywhere is to push it out of the public square, then you're actually embracing a religion of your own in the public square, which is secularism. You're just taking one religion and replacing it with secularism.
No, you're not. Like, secularism isn't a religion. You're not, like, secularism is the only way you deal with a pluralistic society. You cannot privilege a religion in a pluralistic society and have everyone's tax dollars privilege a single religion. So the idea is you have to therefore privilege no religion. It's the only way you can deal with pluralism. Don't go to, well, it's a majority religion, so therefore you get to no. Secularism is the only way in a pluralistic society to actually, it benefits religion as a whole, because it benefits a plurality of religion, not just one sole religion.
And I guess what I'm saying is I'm kind of comfortable with people of different faiths sharing the public square together. But part of that is that if I'm in a 95% Christian community and my local city council wants to put up a nativity display on.
So now he's going down the majority. So, if most of us are Christians here, then I'm fine with actually pushing Christianity on the other 5%. I'm fine with that. Or at least I'm fine with tax dollars being spent because we're majority. What if you're 50.1%? Yeah, still that's a majority. Okay. What if in a given community you're 49%, and go to Dearborn or somewhere like that? You cool with public schools there pushing Islam on non-Muslim children? Like, I mean, I don't know statistics, but just imagine. I mean, I'm sure he'd be like, yeah, no, I'm not cool with that. Okay, so you're cherry picking. I think there needs to be an awful lot of challenging. I mean, Joe Rogan does an okay job of challenging back here, talking about the mandatory element of that is very important. But honestly, like, JD Vance needs a good talking to here.
On, Christmas Eve, I'm okay with that. And that was actually, like, for a long time in our country, actually prohibited.
Yeah.
And so what I think is that we sort of put ourselves in this frame in this country where we said every public display of religion is somehow illegitimate. But I mean, I don't know. I try to live.
Taxpayer funded displays of religion for the purposes of furthering that religious ideology, for sure.
My faith in a way that's consistent across different spheres of my life. I don't preach to people. I don't like walk into the White House, tell my employees, you need to follow Jesus as your Lord and Savior. I just try to live my life in a way that hopefully makes people a little curious about what motivates me and what inspires me. But I also don't think that the expectation should be that we tell religious people they're not allowed to be religious in the public square, because I think that's what we've done over the last 30 or 40 years. I guess, we can agree to disagree. I see the Texas thing as an attempt to correct that.
This episode is brought to you by.
Yeah, no, I disagree with him for all the reasons mentioned. So it is a wedge issue, and he is fine, JD Vance, with advocating for that because he's Christian, whereas I'm pretty sure he wouldn't advocate for that if it was a different religion in a different state or whatever. Like, I don't think any of his arguments particularly stood up there to any kind of decent scrutiny. But yeah, my goodness, good to see that that Joe Rogan is pushing back on some of these. I mean, some of these sort of claims and positions. It's obvious to me that Joe Rogan is non-religious, or at least, maybe culturally so, or very, very casually so. But he's not one to push religiosity. I think he's more of a manosphere, anti-woke, alpha male kind of bloke. But I don't think he's a particularly religious person, and that obviously, he finds an issue with that, and rightly so. JD Vance, slippery as an eel. They're trying to get that wedge issue across the line. Anyway, that's enough for me. Let me know what you think of JD Vance's interactions there with Joe Rogan, and put your comments down below. In the meantime, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. That always really helps out the channel. And thank you to those who have already subscribed to A Tippling Philosopher. Toodle pips.